Hello and welcome back to PA Truck Up. I'm your host Manny, and today we've got three very special guests. We've got Mike Stone, Meg Stone, and Alex Borges. How we doing?
Thanks for having us, Manny.
It's all good. So this has actually been in the making for a while, and I'm really glad that we've finally been able to get here and talk. Again, not that you need much of an introduction, but if you just quickly walk through who you are and where you are at.
Ladies first.
Ladies first, okay. Well, as Alec had said in our chat before we got into your interview, I'm retired, but formerly Director of the Centre of Excellence for Sports Science and Coach Education at East Tennessee State University. But then, as you know, Manny, and I think a lot of people know, that my background is track and field and then movement into strength and conditioning because I've been involved in the heavy events in track and field, really got an into strength and conditioning. And was the first female head coach in the country here in the US at the University of Arizona. Director of strength and conditioning, and then moved on to the same position in Texas Tech, back into track and field for the Scottish national coach position, back to the US, the Olympic Committee in Coaches Education, and then on to ETSU. So that's my Reader's Digest version.
Me? Well, I had to go before Doc because
I'll
them setting the stage. Yeah, them setting the stage, basically enabled me to come here. I was fortunate enough to be on your podcast before, but I ended up here at ETSU because I went to the University of Edinburgh for my master's in strength and conditioning, which I eventually learned was built by Dr. Stone back in the late 90s, and that basically opened the door for me to come here and get my PhD in sport physiology and performance, which I'm graduating with next month. Now my background is more so in American football. That's what I played through my teens at the University of Wyoming eventually, German national team before that, and I had a very diversified journey, if you will, all over the place in different settings, but always leaned towards the high performance side of things. And I think I ended up in the right spot for that, having two amazing mentors sitting next to me. And besides them being professional mentors, we've grown to establish a very close relationship, a friendship that reaches far beyond the school setting and the research and all that. But just grateful to be here, and I'll pass it on to Doc.
Well, I played sports in high school. I started lifting weights when I was off and on, when I was about 11 or 12 years old. I lifted in a few weightlifting meets and so on. But continued to play sports. I was a shot putter in high school and college. But my first love was really weightlifting, and I made my way up to a low-level national class in the United States. And because of that interest, that kind of colored my interest towards science and where I wanted to go. And so I ended up becoming a sports scientist. And, I've been lucky enough to, after I graduated with my PhD from Florida State, I was at LSU for a while, and then Auburn and Appalachian State and Edinburgh University, and then came back to the USOC for a while. I was the head of physiology there, and now I'm at East Tennessee, and we've been lucky enough to have students like Alex and some other really good students here that have gone on and really, produced some good work in the area of sports science and so on. And that's made my life and Meg's life a lot easier, believe me, to have good students like that. I'm still working at ETSU. I'm also an honorary professor at Edinburgh University. I'm working with a student there. And that brings us to here.
Talking to you.
I would say it's a pretty humble summary of who he actually is.
This is fair. I've had the privilege of speaking to both of you in person and Alex in person, and there's a lot more that he's missing out.
Humility is definitely one of Doc's strong suits. It's like one thing that I admire the most in the times of how many letters can you add after your name is the ability to just put MHS, Michael Henry Stone, after, as your signature in your email, and you don't need anything else. You don't need the PhD, you don't need the FNSCA and whatever, right? Like, who I am when I just put MHS at the bottom of an email, right? And I think that is impressive and humble And I think that's much more so of something that I want to emulate rather than, filling out a whole page with letters, right? Let the
100%.
action speak, not the letters. So
I think as well as like when you've authored so many papers and people like Mike is a household name in the strength community. So like if you see MS, you're like, okay, fair.
It could be good or bad, though.
I kind of wanted to bring up something that we were talking in the lobby because obviously we all have different unique experiences, but something that we all have in common is the European US side of the SSE and sort of how that's being developed and developing as we're currently seeing things with the teaching and sports coaching and now S&C. Meg, what were some of the things that you were noticing Europe's side that when you went to the US you were like, okay, let's mix and match and see if this can be more effective? Here's a quick word from our sponsor, TeamBuilder. I've personally been using TeamBuilder since 2022 and it's genuinely changed how I run primitive athletics. Writing programs, delivering them to the clients and athletes, tracking their progress, and it all lives in one place. My clients get their sessions on their phones, I see their progress, I get messages from them, and we are able to stay in constant contact and be able to track every single metric that I need. I spend less time on admin and more time actually coaching. Check out teambuilder.com, and if you use promo code PACHUCKUP altogether, you get 30-day free trial and you get access to the AMS system.
Interesting, Manny, because obviously being in the US, I lean very much more towards an US approach to high performance sport, but I will try not to be overly enthusiastic or negative about either side of the equation. But when you look at Europe way back, there's a history society in general in Europe that's not prevalent in the US. I mean, 200 years is a long, long time in the US. If you look at Europe, there's a huge history back there. And so I think that, like Jay Coakley, who wrote a book called Sport and Society, sport does reflect society. And so there's a newness to sport in the US that you don't find in Europe. For example, women lifting weights. That's been very, very much accepted in Europe for years. If you look at track and field, women were lifting weights way back 30s, 40s, 50s. You look in the US, it was 1972 before women actually got recognised as being an entity that was worthwhile. So there's a big difference there as far as the culture. As far as the approach, both men and women, I think sport is extremely highly thought of in the US, as it is in Europe. But I think there's a whole marketing aspect of sport in the US that we don't have as much in Europe. I think there may be certain sports, for example, soccer in Europe, which, let's face it, soccer is advertised worldwide and it's the most watched sport worldwide. But if you look at the US, what have you got? You've got baseball, football, basketball, all very big in the US, but a different type of approach in the US to marketing those sports. So there's those differences. I come down to the actual individual, and here's where I can get a little bit negative. The individual approach to sport, coaching-wise. There's a very, very upbeat approach to coaching in the US. I've found if you're involved in a sport like football, baseball and basketball, they're all team sports. There's all a feeling in those team sports of, if that flag goes down, somebody's got to pick it up. There's no blame associated. You just got to get the job done and win the game. And that's prevalent in team sports in the US. I think it's maybe prevalent in football in Europe. But I've found in track and field that there's very much what we talked about actually before you started the podcast. There's a block sometimes that you come up against in Europe. This is the way we've done it. This is the way we're going to do it. So don't try to push me out of my comfort zone. And I think that is something that blow those doors off in Europe, that the European, if you could call it coaching, could be doing with blowing the doors off a little bit, opening people's mind. I know as a national coach in Scotland, that was my biggest challenge, was trying to open people's mind to maybe a different way of doing things, and believe it or not, lack of collaboration between coaches. There was always a criticism, never a collaborative effort. And I think that's missing. And it's something that I think you've maybe encountered, Manny.
Oh, 100%. And you've actually said it beautifully. It's like someone's just trying to block your path just because it's perhaps not the way. Again, and so I'm originally from Hawick. And in Hawick, we have a saying that it's I been, which means it's just always been this way. It's I been, it's always been this way, nothing changes. We keep doing it the same way we have been, which is really interesting because like I've heard some stories from your time at the Scottish Institute, and again, you were encountering the same issues that I'm having. So like, it's one of those that's kind of like, if it doesn't take someone very stubborn to finally stop this, what's it going to take for people to like start collaborating, start having a more, let's look out for our athletes, our clients, as opposed to like what looks good on paper for me.
Some very, very, very good athletes come out of Scotland. I mean, some really outstanding athletes. But I think if you think about that critically, they have gone out with Scotland to be as good as they needed to be. And that's a shame. That's a real shame. Because I think if I were to go back and, God forbid, and go back now in my old age, I would have done things a little bit differently. I might have kept my mouth shut completely for a year or two and just evaluated the whole system a little bit more than I did, and then be able to judge the way forward, if there was a way forward. It was interesting because I was there about 6 months until a very, very good coach in Scotland at that point said to me, "Meg, what the heck are you doing back here? You're an entity that's an oddball." I said, "Yeah, well, maybe the oddball can make an impact, but it wasn't to be." I think I did have a little bit of an impact, but not as much as I would have wanted. And there was a lot of good athletes came through in that time. When you look at some of the kids that are even good today, were in the Scottish Bank of Scotland group that started under my...
I will interject just a little bit here. Since I released the episode with you and Doc, a lot of people that I knew from the Scottish Institute did reach out and said, "Oh, it was fantastic when she was here," and they still had that image of what you did for sport in Scotland. So I think a lot more flowers should be given to you because of the stuff that you did do across here.
Thank you for that, because it was a very, very difficult time in my coaching career in Scotland. So to hear that really does make me feel really good. Thank you.
Well, if I could interject here.
This is telling Meg she's great.
I think Meg and some other people associated with her did make a lot of difference. For example, when I first moved over to Scotland, I was quite frankly shocked at the lack of weight rooms. I mean, I think the biggest one we found and the nice one was at Grangemouth, and it was like really small at that time. And I think one of the impacts that we had was we really pushed strength and conditioning. And I really think that, I honestly believe that got the ball rolling. And now there are quite a few decent weight rooms in Scotland, and in fact throughout the UK. I think another thing that happened, and between Meg and Dougie Bryce, I don't know if you know that name or not, but he worked with Sports Scotland there, and we really started an educational program that grew and grew and grew. And in fact, that morphed into the UK Strength and Conditioning Association. And it came out of an educational process that we started over at...
Grangemouth.
Yeah, well, the first one was at Grangemouth. And then we moved over to Largs. They had a sports center over there, and it grew. We started the Scottish Strength and Conditioning Association, and that grew, expanded into the UK Strength and Conditioning Association. So I think from that standpoint, there was an impact there. That may have happened anyway, but nevertheless, I think Meg and Dougie Bryce really had a lot to do with that.
I don't know if it would have happened anyway, to be quite frank, because sometimes it requires a catalyst, it requires an oddball to get the ball rolling. And the other part to that, I believe, is as humans, we're pretty impatient, right? So we think we show up and we knock down the door and hey, here we are, we can make a difference because we know we're good, but then we realize, the difference that we're trying to make is actually not occurring at the pace we wanted or thought it would happen. And then by the time we leave, it's kind of like, the seasons change. You came in the winter and you planted, or you came the year prior and you planted a seed and nothing's coming because you may have come in the winter time. And all of a sudden you leave and it's springtime and whatever you planted is starting to blossom. And the people that you've kind of did the work with while you were there, who stayed behind, continue your work based on the example you set and on the standards that you set. And then you can go and build it from there, right? And I know that didn't happen only in the UK, but Meg and Doc were in Taiwan last year, and they saw that the same thing happened over there. They went over there, 10 years ago or something like that? And you told them, hey, this is what we do. More than that, right? Just a longer time ago, let's say 10, 15 years ago, they went over there and showed or told them, hey, this is what we're building over in the US at ETSU, etc. And this is what we've done in previous settings. And Taiwan went, it's like, okay, this is a great idea. Now they put their own spin on it on the basis of what these two brought over there. Right? So you might not see the impact that you have in the moment, maybe not even in the first 2 years or 5 years, but let it grow. And then 5 years, 10 years down the road, you see that something you did at a certain point in that whole, machinery's evolution, right? You see, okay, this is kind of where we kicked it off.
Yeah.
So
if I could slightly piggyback off that, so Alex might not know who he is, but Gil Stevenson, who was one of the guys from the UKSCA early on, I had the chance of doing a small internship with him, and he had his internationals, and I got exposed to a lot of that from across here. I got exposed to a lot of the Division 1 in Washington, in Seattle, Washington with Coach Mack. But it's this idea of early investments might reap more than just quick, instant sort of decisions. I've got this, so I've now started a program for 4 to 6 year olds and then 7 to 11 year olds. And the idea is not to make them all professionals. That would be great. But if I can start them moving well and getting used to their bodies at 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up to 11, this can carry on to performance programs. This can carry on to them being better humans for society. It's this whole chain link effect that, again, like what Alex just said, one small ripple is going to cause a massive tsunami somewhere else.
Stevenson, he was a regular at our meetings over in Largs, for example, and went through the classes that we put on over there and really took off with it. I mean, he really did a good job. One other aspect, too, that people probably aren't aware of. When I was at Edinburgh, I became a professor and chair of sport. And Dave Collins was the head of the department then. And one of the things that he did was make, in a sense, me an interface between Edinburgh and Sports Scotland. And, myself and some of my students, graduate students, actually did some of the testing for some of the teams there at Sports Scotland. And that was one of the first, real taste of regular sports science, I think, that kind of took off then. And Dave really pushed that.
And that's the other part, right? I mean, you have catalysts like these two, but you also need enablers, right? That see potential in what you're doing and who you are, and then open doors for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting.
Sorry?
Interesting, Manny, when I think of some of the things that went on in those courses that Doc talked about earlier, Alec talking about people helping people. I remember one of our first courses down at Largs for strength and conditioning, and those two guys came to it and they were really enthusiastic about learning the lifting movements. And then 2 or 3 years later, back here in the US, I'm looking at Sir Chris Hoyt. He was one of our first guys that took the course. And I'm looking thinking, gee, maybe we have had a little bit of an impact. So, and it's interesting as you go back, you look at people. Doc talks about people that were at Auburn when he was there. Charles Barkley used to underwater weigh him. Every week the coaches were on him about underwater weighing. So you look at some of these outstanding performers and you think, maybe we did help a little bit, Because there's people like that you meet along the way. Even Alec, I know without even questioning it, this guy's going to have a heck of a career. And I hope when I'm 90, I can sit back and say, we knew him when.
It's not just knowing. I'm here because of these two, period, right? One thing is Edinburgh. Doc built the program at Edinburgh that I got my master's in. And at graduation, I met Dave Collins, the other gentleman Doc just mentioned. And Dave introduced me to Meg and Doc. And then I came to Coaches College and visited, right? And then I applied to the program here, right? And then it's two people enabling you to realize your potential, or even show you, it's like, hey, this is something you didn't even think about years ago, and here you are chasing something major, right? And they help you realize like what you're actually capable of and help you believe in yourself even a little bit more. And I'm 36 years old. I'm not a typical professional student that did their bachelor's, then their master's, then their PhD. Like, I've been in and out of the workforce in Germany, in the US, off and on, and just finally coming here and seeing them and meeting them and spending time around them, learning from them. It's like I'm seeing where I'm supposed to be because of people that had a certain belief and just opened the door. And it was up to me to walk through it, but they opened the door. They enabled a lot of things, provided me with a lot of opportunity. And that's what it takes to eventually sit here and then have one of your mentors say, they're going to be great. They're going to be great. They're going to do some stuff. And then the next part of that is doing it, right? They can believe in it. And now you have to walk through that door again, and you have to put in the work, and you have to prove them right? No, not have to, but you want to. You get to prove them right? With the opportunities that they provided. The saying, I stand on the shoulder of giants. That's exactly what it is.
It kind of goes back to a conversation that me and you had, Alex, and it's the lineage of coaches and how these like small impacts can imprint on not just our own teaching principles and philosophies, but the way that, one, we carry ourselves, and then B, like, help the wider field with it as well. And I think, so I've met a couple of Doc students. I've met you, Tim, a couple of Shanna as well. I've met some people that have coached and been under your sort of programs, and it's that thing of you can always tell the lineage of a coach based on what they're speaking and teaching. If you're from Missouri State, you really like a lunge or a split stance. Coach Mac, it's a tiered method, but you're chaos all the time, and you just have to condition all the time for it. So it's really cool to see the lineages that happen and how it kind of impacts performances and coaches. But my kind of question is going to come from since a lot of the early work was done by you, Doc, and Meg, who were those giants for you?
I know as an athlete, there were a couple of people that really influenced my approach to coaching as well as my ability as an athlete. I think there's three that come to mind with me, and I think you'll recognise the names. Number one was Frank Dick, who actually talent ID'd me as a thrower. And so kudos to Frank, and really has been the kind of person that I can pick up the phone and ask a question of any time, because I pretty much have him speed dialed on my phone. And then second of all was the coach that I worked with in Scotland, who had a tremendous impact on the throws. There he is, Frank Dick. Stuart Toga, who started off as a throws coach in Scotland working with Chris Black, and then I joined that group because it was specific to throwing, and Stuart came over to the US and ended up coaching Lance Deal, who won a silver medal in the Olympic Games. And the third one I would give kudos to would be Carlton Johnson, who at that time was the national throws coach in Great Britain and had a litany of information about throws and was a very good throws coach. And I always refer to him when people say, well, you have to have experienced throwing to coach throwing. No, you don't. Carlton Johnson was a rugby player who was a very, very good coach because he had a good coaching eye. And so those are the three that stand out to me. But there's one that really stands out. I know I said three, but I'm going to four. One who really stands out in the strength and conditioning area, who's massively influenced me in the strength and conditioning area, sitting next to me. You know, we talk a lot. I mean, it's nice to be able to be on the breakfast table and ask, what do you think about this rep and set scheme? And have the maestro sitting next to you at breakfast.
That is better. Now you. This is your turn.
Well, some of them, I don't know if, obviously some of them are from the States, and I don't know if you know them or not, but, I mean, for my heroes, a lot of them are, scientists and so on. Leonardo da Vinci is a hero. Most people know who he is. But I think in my lifetime, I had a professor named Ron Bird that really influenced me. I mean, I'm going to go through more than three, but also Kyle Pierce, who's a colleague, weightlifting coach. You may know the name, I don't know. He's pretty well known in the weightlifting world. Dave Collins, really think a lot of. He is a, you might call a shaker and a mover. I really think a lot of Dave and what he's done. Obviously, I thought a lot of Meg. I married her.
I forced him.
Yeah, there he is. Kyle's a unique person. I was able to marry my best friend. That helped a lot. It helps me understand sport better than I did. In fact, the reason I moved to Scotland was because of that. But I think there's, in all honesty, one of the ways that I've been really lucky is over the years I've had students who go on to, in a sense, make a mark. And I've had several like that, Greg Hoff, Tim Sukamel. Alex is going to do that. I guarantee you that he will. And I've really been lucky in that respect. But just along those lines, you've got some people in Scotland that you brought up some names. Gil Stevenson, I think Debbie Sargent, she went through some of those courses. Debbie is really sharp. And you've got some new up-and-comers like Chris Robinson, who are going to make their mark. Chris works with rolling right now, and there's some really good people over there, I think. And those are my heroes.
Doc, can you elaborate on Da Vinci? Because I know I get to sit in the lectures, and I love hearing things about strength history. And when you talk about the strength history or sports science, and all that, you don't think of Leonardo da Vinci. Like the typical person wouldn't, but there's a good reasoning for why Da Vinci.
As I say, Leonardo da Vinci is right up there with. He was a unique person. We know him for his art, for his science. He was an inventor. He, in a sense, was the father of human biomechanics. He envisioned flight machines before we had flight machines. He did pretty much everything. But one of the things that he also did, from a philosophical standpoint, he really, he said, look, if you're going to be a good scientist, you've got to be more than just, tunnel vision on science. You've got to look around at the world and see how it actually works. And in a sense, a good scientist is a good artist. And I think Leonardo da Vinci embodied that. Another thing that, a lot of people don't realize now, according to his biographers, so this is quite interesting, Leonardo da Vinci was quite strong. Apparently, he could take a horseshoe and bend it with his hands. He once, apparently, like one of those big steel door knockers was able to twist them off and, off the door, according to his biographers, and was quite a good athlete, according to his biographers. And so, right there you've got, in a sense, the beginning of sports science, because he was interested in human movement as well. He was a great anatomist, a fantastic artist, obviously, and he is a person I think everybody ought to take a look at.
And that's just gives you a taste of what lectures are like. People hear a name, people hear block periodization theory or any other thing related to sports science or human performance or whatever, right? But then you get that in-depth view into what's actually behind those words. And that's something that I call myself very lucky, very fortunate that I get to be in those lectures with the fellow students and learning more about why we are where we are as a field right now. Right? Because if you don't understand history, you don't actually fully understand the present. And then appreciating that, right, makes you that much of a better practitioner, right? And like Doc said, it's like, yeah, Da Vinci was an artist. It's like how does nature work, And there's a lot of connection between how nature works and we as human beings work and what actually truly works in training. Right? Yeah, a lot of ways lead to Rome, but some ways are more effective to get there, right? And that is something that we get to study and we get to pursue and we get to experiment. And I think that is something that I've never had an eye for or even understanding for before I came here. So that opened my eyes to seeing things at a much, much deeper level than what people generally see at the surface.
Yeah. I think so. You bring up a good point with Leonardo da Vinci, and he had all these accolades, and like his interpretation of things were probably a lot different than what people were thinking back then. And I kind of have this theory of like it's called the mad scientist theory, and it takes one person to like be really unhinged to the point where like no, I'm just going to try it this way and just stick with it, whether it comes to fruition or not, doesn't matter. You have to be nutty. Like Einstein, I'm going to put like a little bit of early on Brian Mann with the VBT stuff where people were like, it doesn't matter, but he just kept pushing through it. And now VBT is where it is. And like Doc, your research early on was probably like people were like, okay, and then you just kept pushing through. Does that make sense? I don't know if that's the best explanation for it.
I think okay. I don't think we need to go into specifics about different training modalities essentially, but I think you're right that at certain point, it doesn't matter what it is, right? Whether that's a block periodization theory or what you brought up, whether it's VBT or any technological advancement, the computer, right? Cell phones, what have you, right? All those things where it's like, it was a nutty idea and then people realized, oh, there's something about this, right? And with some other things, it's like, oh, there's something about this, but then it dies off where people prove that that thing is not effective. But either way, it takes people that are very, very persistent and believe in it, right? It's kind of how the program here at ETSU was built. It is not so much that Doc came to ETSU and said, I would like to try this, I would like to try that. It's like, this is what I'm going to do, take it or leave it, right? And somebody here said, yeah, okay, let's go with it, right? And it takes somebody with a presence, right? And with a certain authority to be able to do that and then to push forward no matter what, right? Like you said, there has to be a certain persistency, a stubbornness to the whole thing. And although Doc said you can't just be, blinders on and forward, I think there's certain parts or certain times in your career or in your pursuit towards excellence that you have to do that, right? Just to make some progress. And then you got to take them off again and then see the big picture. And then you can always just bring it back in and open it back up. So yeah, I think the nuttiness has to be there. You have to be very convinced about what you're doing. But there's also a point where you can be convinced about a thing and it doesn't actually work, right? The way you think it works. but you're just holding on to it so you don't lose face. Does that make sense? Which is a different kind of nuttiness,
I
if
can
you
think
will.
of a couple examples. So we're back. There were some issues, but everything's fixed now and we're all good. A question I kind of wanted to get to was, I'm fortunate enough to know a lot of husband-wife pairings in the S&C community, and you have kind of touched on that, and it's the collaboration that happens at the breakfast table, at the lunch table, dinner table, whatever it may be. Can you sort of break down how important that is for you guys, and like what are some of the things that you have been able to figure through by having those conversations and having that space for collaboration?
What do you think?
I can speak from my perspective real quick, although I don't have a wife. My girlfriend's a strength and conditioning coach, Noelle, and she's also a physical therapy student right now. So she's obviously very, avid for sports and working with athletes. And, we have that ability too to, talk about training, talk about best interventions. And now with her being on the medical side of things, like sports medicine and return to play or return to activity, whatever, it's like I get a whole nother view of how to address certain injuries, right? She's the one pursuing that degree, but through conversations, I'm learning so much more about the human body, human anatomy, right? How do tissues work, right, at a much deeper level. And this is something that I talked to Meg and Doc early on in my degree here, is I go to class and I grasp concepts, right? Like the concepts, I get them, right? But then conversations and spending more time on a certain subject fills in the detail, right? And that is something that Doc always emphasizes is, hey, get the concepts. You will as long as you understand the concepts, the details fill in. And I think that's where conversations at the dinner table, on dates, or just waking up over coffee, you talk about training, you talk about the body, and you talk about activity and whatever. Like, you learn so much more. And that is my side of things with my partner. And maybe that bridge the gap a little bit here for you guys.
Well, I think one of the things that I think is really important from my point of view from learning is the trust that I put in on the information that I'm getting or that I get from Doc when I'm coaching. If you ever sit in on Dr. Stone's lectures, and I've lost count of the number of lectures I have sat through and listened to with Doc, because he always is very keen to get feedback. Did that go well? Do you think I got that across, whatever? But when you watch his lectures and listen to his lectures, there is a predominant, overwhelming amount of references. Yep. I mean, every slide that comes up has a massive bunch of references at the back of it. And several of the students have mentioned that to me. When you've got that amount of references and you have that amount of ability to say, look at this reference or try that reference and this will expand upon this, I put a lot of trust in what the research that has been done. And I know Doc has always said, don't ever rely on one article for research. It's the body of evidence. And when you look at the body of evidence that Doc presents, when he's discussing a certain subject matter in strength and conditioning, you've got to be able to put your trust in that. And so when I'm talking to Doc about something, he recommends something, I put my trust in it. That's really how I have, worked the strength and conditioning issues that I've had with athletes. Now, you just put your trust in that your relationship with the athlete that you have will buy into what you're trying to promote. A huge amount of trust in. And I know Doc has always said, this issue about the science, being able to measure it and being able to be trusting your measurements. So if you take all that into account, hey, I put a complete trust in what Doc's telling me because I know he is well researched.
Well,
follow that, Dr. Stone.
I think like Alex said and Meg backed up, one study doesn't make truth. You've got to really, we're talking about a 4-hour lecture here. But basically, it's not just simple observation. You've got to observe carefully the world. You've got to try to measure the world more than once, try to come up with what is actually true in the world. And that's what science is all about. What is really true in the world? And can we discover it? And you don't do that through one measurement. It takes a lot to do that. I mean, the whole idea of science is objectivity and eventually getting to what is true. And that's important. But I'd like to get back, because this kind of relates to that. I'd like to get back to what we were talking about before we had the interruption there. If you're going to build a program, you've really got to be able to surround your people with like-mindedness, if that makes sense. Otherwise, everybody's going to go their separate ways, and you end up with not a program. And I'll tell you, Manny, that's hard to do, to surround yourself with people who have similar goals. And sometimes you have to put your foot down and say, no, that's not the direction that we're headed. We're supposed to go in this direction. And that, that ruffles feathers and so on, but so be it. If you're really gonna have a good program, no matter what it is, sports science, entomology, whatever, you've got to surround yourself with people who are, so to speak, on board. And they're all willing to go in the same direction. And Manny, that's really hard to do. I mean, it's really hard to surround yourself with those people. Even though they tell you that's what they want to do, it doesn't always turn out that way. And so in trying to put together a sports team, a scientific team, a sports science team, you got to look for those people. And it's, as I say, really hard to do. But if you're going to be successful over a reasonably long period of time, you've got to do that.
I want to add on to that, if I may. The other day I had a reflection on exactly what Doc was talking about, and I think an overarching theme of what Doc's talking about is commitment. And commitment to the greater cause, not so much commitment to just oneself. The way I reflected upon it is like, hey, I have a commitment to myself, being the best professional and person that I can be. And at the same time, I also have I expect a commitment from my peers, right? The people that I work with on a daily basis, whether that's the fellow students in my program, or that's Meg and Doc, which I don't have to, set that expectation because they set the expectations here, right? And I am committed to that. Like, they set the standard. Now, the commitment to those that we serve, rather than putting us first and our opinion first, right? And what I mean by that is, in academia, that's the student, right? We have to put the student first and their experience. And Meg and Doc have been exemplars of, great examples of that, right? They put the student first and their development over their own needs, even over their own finances, if you will, right? And the history of this program really shows that. On the side of the athlete, when you get into strength and conditioning, when you get into sports science, the sports science side of things should not be so much about, oh, hey, I have all these publications, I have all these titles, right? But I am doing this work so the end user's performance is dialed in, right? That's what I'm doing it for. I'm doing it for the athlete that is doing it now and the athletes that are doing it in the future, right? And that's what we're shooting for here. And I think if you have people that are aligned.
Today's episode is sponsored by Eccentric. You all know I'm a big fan of keeping training simple and effective, and flywheel training fits that perfectly. Now, I've been using Eccentric K-Box since 2021, and it's one piece of equipment, endless exercises, and resistance that adjusts to you automatically. However much effort you put in is what you get out. No guessing the weight, no loading plates, just move. And the flywheel matches your effort perfectly. Check out the K-Box or the K-Pulley at the link in the description.
My point being is commitment to the greater cause, right? You were listening to Doc earlier, like with Da Vinci, like he had the big picture in mind, and he found a lot of different ways to contribute to the greater cause, right? And I think it is about serving or not forgetting about who you're doing your work for, right? And Doc has mentioned many times in the past his love for sport, right? And the love for sport is what drives his work, and the same goes for Meg, right? And we always distinguish between, or we like to define sport when compared to recreational exercise and so on and so forth, right? So having people that are on the same page, and you were talking about Tim and Shanna, and we talked about Greg Haffen, like we all have the same understanding of, hey, what is sport, right? And what is sports science versus what is exercise science, right? And so we like to distinguish between these things, and I think that comes with a lot of work with your head down and making sure that people understand that where you're coming from, like this is the way, and people buy into that, because again, you provide so much evidence that people don't have a choice but to trust what you're putting down on the table, right? And that makes someone like me, it helps me to easily commit to that, because I use logic a lot, right? When I sit in class lectures, I use logic when I deal with human beings, when I coach and all that, right? And you combine that logic with the observations and truths that we find through the research and through the daily work that we do, and all of a sudden you figure out pretty quickly what actually truly works and what is just kind of wishy-washy. And some things that like, we need to investigate this further, right? But I think the bottom line is commitment to the greater cause, commitment to the people that we actually are here to serve, because we're not just doing it for ourselves. People need a paycheck. People need to be able to, build the life that they want to lead and have a lifestyle, be able to build a lifestyle that they want to lead. I think having a greater purpose with your work and having people around you with that same purpose in that work, that's where great things come about. And the best example are the students that are already in the field doing the work. Like the Greg Haves and Tim Sukumelas and Guy Hornsby's and John Waggles, all those guys all over the place that came from this spot and are now out there doing the good work on a really, really solid foundation. And that's the like-mindedness I think they are talking about, that they've been able to find in each other, and then also recruit students that are able to understand what they're putting down, and us buying into that because we trust the information that they're giving us. And reverting that back to the very beginning of our conversation, or bringing it back to the very beginning, is your challenge with implementing your initiatives in strength and conditioning with children is you are finding a lot of people who are not yet like-minded. So you're going to have to do a lot of convincing, grassroots type of work, right, to bring people on board. It's like, okay, you don't want to listen yet, but I'll show you through my actions what I'm able to do for these kids and how it sets them up for their teenage years and their physical development and their health, right? And by your example, you show people, hey, this is what I've done over the last 5 years with these kids, and look at where they're at now and how they're set up for the next chapter of their life. And then you get people to buy in, and all of a sudden, more and more people become like-minded. And that's what we talked about earlier. They went to Scotland. They started showing up, something that people were maybe reluctant to in the beginning, but more and more people started to buy in, became like-minded. And those like-minded people then continued the work that they did and built it into the UKSCA and so on and so forth, right? While Meg and Doc went to bigger and better places and kept doing the same thing, influencing more and more people, right? And then kind of spreading that word about, hey, this is the search for truth. This is what we know. This is what we find. This is what we don't know. That's my 2 cents on that.
It's interesting, Manny, because I've heard people say something like, I want to make an impact on this profession. I want to make an impact. Well, you never, if that is your sole goal, and that's your sole aim, I think you're on hiding to nothing. Because if I want my name out there making an impact, that's great. Information will go out. But really, from my point of view, the best way to do that is to give yourself to what you're really interested in. Get your head into what are you really interested in. And if you do that, the kudos come with it. And I'll give you an example of that. Kate Howie. You familiar with Kate Howie? Yeah? Judo, Olympic medalist. I interviewed her as part of my thesis, and the thing that struck me most about her was when she said, in coaching, from being an athlete, you go from being a selfish athlete to a selfless coach. And she's a demonstrator of it. She demonstrates that. She went into coaching and started at the very beginning, level 1, level 2, went right through the coaching pathway as a coach, learning how to coach and realising that as an athlete there was some shortcomings. So she got that taken care of and then became the Olympic coach, you know, because of a deep, deep passion and interest in what she had. And I think that's the example of the way to do things, is to find your passion, pursue your passion, get it done, without saying, I want to be the great I am. Immerse yourself in what you're interested in, and you become known as a side effect to the impact you're having on who you're working with.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
100%. I've got an example for that. During the creation of this program that we've kind of mentioned a couple times, I realized that like if this is going to happen, I need to stop marketing to coaches and to governing bodies. If this is going to be successful, I'm going to have to reach the buyers, which are the mums and dads, the parents, the guardians, the ones that look after the child. So I spent a good month meeting with mums, dads, talking about like their kids, their activities, what they do to recover, what they do food wise. So like when it came to develop my stuff, I already had these like check boxes on like, okay, if I'm advertising to parents and that's who's going to buy into this program and support this program, these are their worries. Let me make sure that these boxes are ticked before I advertise this. And I think that switch of like what you've just talked about with Kate Howie is like she stopped being the athlete and say like, how can I serve the athletes?
To a simple needs analysis, right? Hey, you think you have a great idea, but if there's no need for that idea, or what you think is the right idea, then it's not going to go very far, right? But if you just keep that idea that you have in the back of your head, right, just put it on the side, then figure out what the market, quote unquote, actually needs, and then serve it, and then eventually you can bring your idea back, and as people understand what you're trying to build, then you can bring the original idea or feed things from the original idea back in and develop it from there. But like you said, you have to identify what the market wants at that point, which in a sports setting, it's pretty clear cut what, especially as you go into high performance, there's no debate about what an athlete needs, right? We have all these sports. We know more or less the key performance indicators for those sports. We know, what throwers need. We know what American football players need. We know what soccer players need, right? But identifying how we go best about filling that need, serving that need, right? That is, I think, where the sports science part comes in. And when I'm going to go back to Meg here, or previous statements, is going into the evidence rather than opinion, right? So, a lot of what happens out in our field right now, whether it's strength and conditioning and fitness and all that, a lot is opinion, right? Mm-hmm. And it seems that evidence-based work almost gets a bad rep because it is not attractive, almost, right? And so being able to communicate that truth, essentially, in a more attractive fashion, might get people to buy into it more. I don't know, right? I don't really have the answers yet, but it's something that I'm seeing. It's like, okay, why are we still in 2026 doing certain things that are not really conducive to what athletes actually need, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's flashy, because it is based on opinion, because the person themselves that are doing it or coaching it, quote unquote, they are able to sell themselves very well. But it doesn't mean that the product or service that they're selling is actually effective, is actually safe, and actually progressible or progressive, if you will, to develop athletes. And the higher you go in terms of level of play, level of competitiveness, the smaller the margin for error becomes, right? You would be shocked to learn that people at the highest levels, even in an American sport, engaging in practices that are not really conducive to what the athletes actually need. And that's from team sports to individual sports. The last point I'm going to make here is something that Meg just mentioned about Kit Howie, is she went through a level 1 and a level 2 and so on and so forth. So there was a development pathway to becoming a coach, and I'm sure that this development pathway is also based on evidence, on coaching development, on coaching education to bring coaches to a certain level of capability, right? Where, and this is something that the cultural difference that we talked about early on between the American side versus the European side, is coaches come up kind of through grandfathered in positions, for lack of a better word. It's like, oh, because that lineage was there, I'm just going to bring this person up through it. Whereas in Europe, there is this very systematic approach to developing coaches that doesn't exist here, right? And especially sport coaches, but also strength and conditioning coaches, sports science, right? That there's not a true development pathway. Some things are very opinionated, even in sports science, right? You have this school of thought and this school of thought and this school of thought. And if you come up through this one, you don't appreciate what these guys are doing and you talk crap about what those guys are doing, right? And what are we doing there? There's no alignment to serve the end user the best way possible, because we're feeding opinion rather than truth, evidence, right? Whatever nature is telling us by repeated observation, what Doc mentioned earlier, right? So
one thing I kind of want to say, and it kind of goes back to what Mike and Meg were saying about, for every slide there's 4 or 5, 6 different references, and how much you can't just rely on one paper to guide your train of thought. I had a conversation with Paul Comfort a while ago, and in some universities, lecturers say that you can't go back 5 years to find more research. So you've got a 5-year gap to how much research you can go back on. So say we're in 2026, my specific uni said that I can't go past 2021 for research. So, which is insane. And it's something I always challenged them on. And it was like, and this is, again, going back to the conversation that I had with Paul, and it was like, but if you don't get the context before that year, you don't know what it's actually talking about. So like, why not go to the 70s? Why not go to the 80s, 50s, 40s, whatever the year may be, to really grasp what the terminology and understanding of that thing was and how it's applying to nowadays. So like, that's something that I've found quite frustrating when talking about research papers with coaches across here, is like they're quoting stuff from like a couple of years ago. And I'm like, okay, but like, where's this came from? Like, who originally started speaking about this? What was the context behind it?
Interesting, Manny. We've got the expression over here, and I'm sure you have in Scotland too. What's old is new again. When I was training in the 70s and people before me in the 50s and the 60s, we used to talk about hopping and bounding. We're going to do some bounding training, hopping down. All of a sudden, I came to the US in 1980 and discovered I'd been doing plyometrics for the past 20 years. So it's just, an evolution. Medicine ball work. I had been doing medicine ball work in 1970, 72. I came to the US, and when I asked for a medicine ball, I was taken to the absolute dungeon of the football stadium and presented with the one medicine ball that they had down there that they'd had since 1920. All of a sudden, medicine ball has come back into folk. So what's old is new again is worth looking at, because a lot of what's old isn't old, or what's new isn't new. It's been tried and true years ago.
And it's been forgotten because people make you go back only 5 years, right? And people that actually have the courage, if you will, to go back further, right? They actually see, oh, this was already done. Let me actually revamp this, put a new name on it, and just sell something old as something new, right? So it's kind of a plague. It's kind of a plague that we experience. Obviously, if people find a way to market it, right?
It's one of the things that also worth mentioning here, Manny, is this want that elite level competitors have for the gadget that's going to get them there. And that's why they look to maybe something that isn't as usable or isn't as well researched, because they think it's the catalyst that's going to shoot them to something else. And so all of these widgets and gadgets and approaches to things come up, and they're trying them in order to get an edge without looking at whether it's been really effective and well researched.
Yeah, I think that is a lot of what we see in the sports technology side of things, right? We have all these wearables and technologies essentially that provide us with a lot of data. You know, a lot of people don't really know what to do with that data. Like, it gives you, like, you know, put on a GPS unit on somebody, and it gives you so many different metrics, while maybe a handful, if that, actually truly matter. Again, for a certain context, for a certain athlete, and the same variables don't matter at all to the next population. So, yeah, I mean, there's value to them if you have them, but a lot of it comes down to what, you know, Meg was saying. The things that worked in the 70s and 80s, they still work now, but people think we need to always do something new to progress. I work with a women's soccer team here, and the coach that I work with, he reminds the women all the time, it's like, you know, 80% of life, somewhere around that number, right? 80% of life is mundane, and mastering the mundane, mastering the simple stuff is actually what makes that makes progress, essentially, right? And we always try to look for something more exciting because we get bored so quickly, right? And I think that stands in the way more than anything else.
100%. We've spoke a lot about development of students, development of research and programs. And I kind of wanted to go back to one of the original points that we wanted to discuss was, again, Alex is a great example of the internship process that goes on at ESTU, and how are you looking at developing these programs and student internships and, you know, the development of the future coaches?
Manny, I think there's several things that come to mind when you ask about the development of programs and the development. I think you have to spread your tentacles. We were very fortunate that when we came to ETSU, we had a champion. We had somebody in this university who saw the value of what we were doing and encouraged us to build this program. And not me, Dr. Stone, sold this program to our president, encouraged that enthusiasm that you can sense from Dr. Stone on sports science. So we established the program. From there, we have been fortunate enough to have some outstanding students. In fact, 2 of our students went over to the medical centre here and were first and second in their statistic class in medical school.
Genetics.
Yeah. So, you know, the students...
It was actually a genetics class.
Oh, it was actually, Dr. Stone's correct me, it was a genetics class. So, you know, the students that we've had go through our programme have been outstanding. So, talking about the tentacles, they're out in the field now, doing their own version of the sports science programme at ETSU. In fact, 2 weeks ago, we had last Saturday, we had a call from a young man who's at a very well-known university in the US, who has just been hired as the director or the programme director for the master's students at his university to develop the whole sports science programme. And would we consult with him? And, you know, we really don't need to consult with many of these programmes, because they know it, they've been through it. So they're out there in the field building their own programmes. And we could rattle off numerous universities who have now started the programme. They started right here at ETSU, and I think that wasn't our intention initially. Our intention was to get word out about sports science and how valuable it was, or is, but it has emerged generically, gone out into the field. Those people are out there now promoting it. So I think if you build, it's a question, we're going back to good old Kevin Costner. If you build it, they will come. And we built it, and they are coming, and they're understanding the value. The thing that is irritating me personally more than anything is that the field has branched into sport technology, which is not purely sports science. It's a tool in sports science, but it's not sports science as an entity in itself. So that's where my thoughts are. So I'll sit back. Over to you, Dr. Stone.
Well, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, that's actually a good point, because the point that Meg makes about sport technology being the understanding of what sports science is, and that is something that I'm running into in my job application process right now. It's actually, how's that saying go? It would be funny if it wasn't so sad. Okay, so you hear a lot about, oh, this is the director of sports science, this is the sports science or performance science specialist on our staff, right? And you see that a lot in collegiate sports, whether it's college football, where the director of sports science, as they're called, are an assistant strength coach that is able to collect GPS, VBT, and some force plate data. Maybe they have a force frame and get some data collected, right? And they have an avidity for, building a dashboard and putting this stuff together. And that is the understanding of sports science. And we're talking about elite sport in the US, meaning Power 4 schools, NFL, etc., right? Where the understanding of sports science is, how to use GPS, VBT, and a force plate, and you're able to create a dashboard with Power BI. And now you're a sports scientist, where that is not it, not even remotely, right? And like Doc said earlier, it could be a 4-hour lecture on what it actually is, right? But that's the education part. Is a lot of people that are hiring for sports science positions, for sports scientists, they don't even know what sports science is, right? They grab some generic explanation, maybe even off of ChatGPT or some governing body's website of, this is a sports scientist, so this is the job description, right? While there's so much more to the work of a sports scientist, right? And a lot of people call them sports scientists, call them, even a Dr. Stone, he said, 5 years after my PhD, I didn't even consider myself a sports scientist. That is something that comes over time, right? But we're in the day and age where a lot of it comes down to titles, right? And you're the director of sports science, but you're not directing much of anything, right? You are collecting data that may or may not be used for strategic decision making by the director of strength and conditioning or human performance or high performance or sport performance or whatever you want to call them, right? And do you have a coach, a sport coach, the actual decision maker for how practices are sequenced, how the annual plan, if you will, is built? Do they even have an understanding of what you're putting down? We have a lot of people now that can create beautiful dashboards, but are meaningless to people that have no understanding about the things that you're putting down. So now the educational component comes back into play. And can you actually educate somebody that has no background in any of the data collection and physiology, etc.? Can you help them understand what you're actually trying to convey to them to optimize what the athletes are doing, right? And a great example is Indiana football that just won the national championship. There's a lot of schools around the nation that still have 24 period football practices like we did 11 years ago, 12, 13, 14 years ago when I played, right? While Indiana goes out and they have 45-minute, 1-hour practices. The athletes are fresh. They're focusing on just the things that they absolutely need. Well sequenced, well informed, right? And that is because there are people in the background, right, that help make those strategic decisions, right? And those people tend to be great difference makers, right? But there are still so few of them, and people don't really know how can we create more of them. Yeah, it's just a lot of reflections that I have had in recent months as I'm in this field, where people tell me with a PhD in sport physiology and performance that I don't have enough experience in sports science. You know, and I've been in this field, you know, including being an athlete for 12 years or more, right? I was a high performance athlete, right? And then I eventually became, through military and different steps along the way, I was in various high performance settings, and I've always been involved in a coaching capacity along that way for over 8 years, right? So, and then people then tell me, you don't have enough experience in this field or that field or this population or that population or in sports science. And I'm like, I have a terminal degree, right? I have experience as an athlete, as a scholar, not the research experience Doc has, right? But as a researcher, right? As a teacher, even as a manager, right? So hearing those kinds of things are excuses from people that don't really know what they're hiring for, right? So where do we start with that, right? We need to start with educating people and providing some context as to, okay, you're hiring for sports science, but what is it? Do you even know what you're hiring for, or are you just hiring because that school over there did it and that school over there did it? And we kind of have to go with the flow, right? That's what irritates me, just like something that irritated Meg. It's something that irritated me as well, because people don't really know what they're going for.
So when this conversation originally started, me and Doc were speaking. I still remember we were by the weight rack, the dumbbells, and Doc was sort of getting to know what I was about and my initiatives and, you know, why I do what I do. And one of the things that we were talking about was like, I want to build this initiative for coaches to not just learn from one way of doing like something, one system, and be able to sort of take what really works, develop it into what they need, and then be able to present that. And it kind of goes into like what you were saying before about the metrics and what is actually being analyzed. It's like we, in one platform, we can get up to 54 KPIs. Like, do we need that? No. Like, let's figure out 3 or 4 that we may need that's actually impactful to the program, and then implement them well to the training. And so my thing with Doc was like, how can we develop an internship program, a development program for coaches to be able to like come out in a system that like 5-10 years down the line, it's still usable. Like we always talk about this pendulum of like, okay, we're really good strength and conditioning coaches. Now we're really good sports scientists. Now we're really good coaches. But like, how can we be so undeniably good at the fundamentals that no matter where the pendulum is, if we keep going the same direction, we will get our athletes, we will get our coaches to that one sort of final performance.
What do you think?
Dr. Stone?
Go ahead.
I think... Go ahead. No, go ahead, Doug.
Go ahead.
Well,
I'll collect my thoughts. Go ahead.
yeah, I think, again, going back to what I was talking about before, you've got to keep a team together. You've got to have in a sense, a focus on what direction you want to move. And like Alex was saying, sports science is, unfortunately, people think about it as some big broad area that encompasses exercise science, sport technology, data analytics, sport medicine, and so on. And yeah, there's some overlap. There's no doubt. Sports science uses some of those tools, but the purpose of sports science is to improve sport performance. So you use tools developed by sport technologists and so on, but it's not sport technology. It's not sports science. It's not data analytics. It's not exercise science. I mean, exercise science really pretty much focuses on health aspects and not sport. I think one of the things that we were able to develop here, I don't know whether it'll be sustained here or not, but one of the things we were able to develop was the interface between a university academic program and sports, where we work hand in hand towards a common goal of improving athletes' sport performance. I really think there's some value in that. I mean, you've got the Omri, Harriet Watts right there, Edinburgh's not far away. I mean, I sincerely believe that a cooperative program could be made between what goes on there and the students at those universities, and then develop those sorts of things at other universities as well. Finland has a similar type of thing. For example, the University of Jyväskylä has students actively working over at Korteni, for example, which is their primary Olympic training center. They have labs over at Korteni and so on. Those sorts of cooperative programs are, I think, quite important. And for about 20 years it's operated here at East Tennessee. Whether that continues or not here, I don't know. But there are other people out there that are beginning to understand the process. And if you've got like-minded people, you can develop that. And I think you can do that in Scotland as well.
Manny, I think Doc is hitting on something that's really, really important. There's a stage, though, that you need to go through. And I know you know this, and I know you're going to go, yeah, when I say this. There's this issue between academics and coaching. And you talk to a coach, hard-dyed, hard-in-the-wool coach about academics. They don't know anything about the sport. We need to break that barrier down. First of all, that needs to be broken. I interviewed a young lady again for my thesis that said to me, and I won't say who or what or where or what sport, but she said, I hid the fact I was doing a PhD in sport performance from the soccer group that I was involved with, because I knew what the coach would say. Oh, she's just a dynamic academic. She doesn't need to be involved with sport. And it's that sport academic friction that needs to be broken down, because how are you going to learn to coach unless you have an educational coaching process? But there's still those old boys out there that don't like the old, here they come, the academic is coming in here telling us what to do, we're coaches. That whole thing has got to be broken down. And I think it's still very prevalent in Scotland.
I think it's prevalent in many places, especially considering that we're in a very applied human-centered profession, right? While most of the programs arguably are happening in a classroom, right? And so they are being taught by academics to students in a classroom setting while they're not coaching actually, right? And so what Meg and Doc are saying and what they've been able to accomplish here over the last 20 years is fully integrating academics with coaching, right? Now, when you consider the old boys that Meg refers to, it's like, okay, well, how could we break this down? Is as academics approach these coaches, if they are open to collaborate, right? That is the first thing. Are you open to collaborate, right? Because you have something to give that we cannot give the students in a classroom setting. So if you have coaches that are open to it, right? And these are the traditional internships that you're talking about, right? But the internship programs that we see, especially here in the US, like summer internship, spring internship, winter internship, right? They're just like a couple of months, right? The program that we have here, we are full-time strength and conditioning coaches for 3 years if you're in the PhD program. If you're in the master's program, 2 years. If you're doing both, you're 5 years, right? So you are a strength and conditioning coach for 5 years by the time you graduate, with a PhD, right? Now, in the beginning, as you're a master's student, you are likely an assistant to somebody who's already been there for 3 years, right? While under the supervision of somebody higher, which, when Meg was still in, she was the director of the Center of Excellence for Sports Science Coach Education. So she was sitting at the top of the helm saying, hey, this is how we want to do things. Then we have coaches that come up through the ranks that teach the next generation, that the next incoming students, hey, show them the ropes, basically, right? Because you have an experienced strength coach at the very top, right, that teaches them the ways, like the senior students essentially that have been there, right? And the senior students they pass it on to the next generation, and so on and so forth, right? And there's obviously a long-term process, and you have to have people willing to contribute to formal education, right? Whereas, the typical internships that I mentioned, they are completely separate entities, right? Where we are it's one entity, it's one thing. And so I think that is what it comes down to, is bringing some very experienced people on board to teach the practical side of things. Like, you can learn a lot about the theory and the textbooks and the evidence, right? The lectures with all the references, that's the classroom, right? But then you need to go and apply that knowledge first as an assistant, as somebody looking over somebody's shoulder who has more experience. And you need to do that on a daily basis, not just one summer in your 2-year master's program or in your 4-year PhD program that is mostly academically based and you have to do some scientific research, but you're never interacting with athletes if you're in the sports science settings, right? So if you're in an applied setting, you need people, practitioners that have a lot of experience, that you are basically walking, you're shadowing the whole time, and you're applying yourself and the knowledge that you gather in the classroom, and you put it into action right away. And that's the only way you can actually progress the field and the practitioners that come into the field, right? Because a lot of these kids, they might do their, personal trainer work at the rec center of the university, and we all know how that goes, right? But if you have people that are always left and right of an experienced strength coach that is involved with academic work, as the practitioner, I think that's when you have a chance to really bring up the field and raise the ceiling for everybody.
Just to round that off, Manny, visualise this. You're at Edinburgh University. Hibs or Hearts, or what they're calling them themselves these days, I'm not sure. But they have practice in, let's say, 10 till 12 or 3 till 5 in the afternoon. Your student comes in and has class from 8 till 9, sport conditioning or whatever, ends 10 till 12 with Hibs on the field, coaching and learning or observing from professional coaches. Back to Edinburgh for lunch, out in the afternoon, 2 till 4 or whatever practice time is, back in the classroom 5 till 6. In other words, what Dave Collins and a lot of other people, us included, have called pracademics, practical and academics in combination. Day to day to day. Not sitting in the classroom for a semester and doing a 2-week internship at whatever, but integrated. That way you open yourself up for good learning practices, but also research in the classroom. You see it on the field, I wonder what is the best way to teach X. Well, let's take it back into the classroom and find out. Or let's ask some of the coaches if they're willing to do some research with their player. They're academy people, and then bring that up into the first team. Whatever research they find, whatever findings there are from the research. So it needs, if we're going to advance sport, that has to happen.
So something that I still to this day, I'm mind blown by it. Was obviously Doc has the experience that he has and the accolades that he has. But again, we got to train together, and I saw Doc squat 100 kilograms. That's not an easy thing to do. So not only is he a great researcher, a great teacher, practitioner, but he's also he's still about it. He'll still go into the weight room and do his workouts and do his work. And I've been speaking a lot about experimenting and when and how do we introduce new tools to our toolbox and to our programs. And it's always that one thing is you have to be about it too. You can know all the theory, you can know all of the research element, but Meg's just said, the practical has to be there too. Yeah, it's one thing that I'm still Mike's still chasing it.
And I think that is so important. And we talked about the whole new era of sports science, if you will, right? And you have a lot of these people that are creating beautiful dashboards and can collect some data and all that, but they don't do the work. The physical work, right? They are not actually the ones squatting. They are not actually the ones lifting, right? And I'm not saying everybody's that way, right? But let's think back to Doc's generation of sports scientists and researchers, right? We have Doc, we have the Bill Kramers, and we have the Dr. Hatfields, right? And all those guys, these guys are PhDs, these are researchers, these are sports scientists, but they have skin in the iron game, right? Mm-hmm. So, having people that have actually done the work, have done the literal and figurative heavy lifting for the field, and they still live it, right? They still exemplify what the whole thing is about and do the thing that has worked and continues to work, right? While being able to tune out the noise, right? 100% agree with you. Being invested in whatever you're doing, whatever you're researching, you need to be doing it. You can't just be in the lab. You have to be in the weight room. You have to move the weight. You have to feel what it is that you are prescribing, what you are suggesting to people. There's no way around that, I believe, if you're wanting to be good at what you do and impactful, essentially.
With the sort of way that the industry is going, how do you think that we can go back to the more academic and coaching sort of being a bit more coherent as opposed to like, this is my side, this is your side?
Okay. You asked us to come on the podcast, right? And this is the essence of it, I think, is people want to share knowledge. Like, I don't know many people that if you ask them to share knowledge or ask them for help, that say no, right? Most people, I think everybody that I'm engaged with on a regular basis would tell you, I'll help you, right? I'll help you. I'll do what I can with what I have. And I think that's what it comes down to. People will want to help you. So reaching out to practitioners wherever they are. Experienced strength coaches they're out there, right? And I'm sure that they're open to teach, open to share their knowledge with people, right? And bringing them on board, I think, is what it takes to get rid of that disconnect, right? Especially in this new generation where it's so easy to just get stuck behind the screen and not be involved in the actual work, right? And getting out there and starting to apply it because, yeah, it's comfortable sitting behind the screen and, playing around with the dashboard and all that. Like I said, sorry I get so hung up on dashboards and all that, but it's the truth, man. And it's what I'm seeing all around me and the people that have done the work, they are open to it, man. We want to help, right? Whenever I get asked, hey, Alex, can you explain this? The other day, an intern with the men's soccer team came to me, asked me, hey, how do you think I should go about speed training this guy that misses a half hour of practice? What can I do for him? And it's like, man, I'm going to give him the time of day and give him 10 minutes of my thoughts, right? And he's just so thankful, right? And all of a sudden you have built something, a certain connection, and now that person wants to learn more. And you are not that person that is out of reach as a practitioner, whether that's a big-time D1 strength coach or a pro-level strength coach or, a Dr. Stone, or right, you're not that far out of reach. If you just reach out, people will share their knowledge. Now, if you're 18, 19, 20 years old, you might be too shy to reach out. So it's also on that generation, that older generation of teachers, of educators, of coaches, to make that move to that generation, say, hey, I'm available, just reach out, right? And then creating some opportunities, webinars, seminars, workshops, clinics, where these experienced people invite the next generation. And not always for profit, but for the sake of teaching. Because a lot of what we do these days, like how can we make a buck? How can we make $250 off this webinar? Man, you sit here and we sit here and we are investing a couple of hours of our day for free, essentially. And this is providing free education to people that are willing to sit down for 2 hours and listen, right? So you're doing the Lord's work, basically, by enabling free educational opportunities, right? And I know you had Bo Sandoval and all these guys on the podcast. This is a huge educational hub that you've created, right? And other people have too. Now, we talk about it a lot, but create some opportunities for practical application. Man, how big a deal is it to meet up on a certain Saturday in your region or in the southeastern region here in the US or wherever, right? And just invest an afternoon for free. And the people that are available show up. And I teach you something. And based on that, all of a sudden a network grows, right? And I have another contact I can reach out to, right? And that contact can connect me to the next person. And all of a sudden I'm on a better way to improving as a practitioner or future practitioner, right? As a new coach. And I think openness has to come from the people that are more mature, right? And making connections, like Meg said, from the academic side to the practitioner side. Openness, willingness to share, willingness to learn, right? People always talk about, oh, I'm a lifelong learner, right? But then if they're being asked to listen even, older experienced people, it's like, hey, here's a sports scientist trying to teach you something, but you're so closed off because you think you're so experienced. That's a problem too. So openness has to be everywhere for people to grow, and for the next generation of coaches, because there's always going to be another generation, right? Openness on all sides to kind of, rising tides raise all boats type of thing.
I've got this blog post I'm wanting to write, and it's essentially on kind of what you're saying, Alex, and it's sometimes listening to the interns and seeing what their interpretation of things might be. Not necessarily that they might be right, but listen to what they're getting from this one thing that I'm teaching, or this one thing that has come up in the weight room, or the, as Alex, you love to mention, the dashboards, right? Something that has came up that, their interpretation might be different to what we're used to as people that have been in the industry for 10 plus years, right? And again, this podcast kind of started with like me just speaking to friends, and then I managed to get some bigger coaches on. And it's like one contact kind of helped each other. And like one thing I love about this podcast is I get to speak to amazing coaches and learn all the time. And for me, this learn is free. So if it's free for me, why can it be free for everyone else? So like this blog post is kind of like, how can we take the overall message from what the interns are saying and say like, okay, is there a different way that this can be applied to achieve the same goal? Or can this be done in a way that, is more receptive to the athletes? Because like interns are better at speaking to athletes than sometimes the head coaches are. So like, how can we bridge those gaps in between the head coach and the interns and not look at them as just like weight cleaners or floor cleaners or whatever it is that some programs do?
I'm lucky to have an intern right now working with women's soccer with me, and he's a soccer player himself, right? So his perspective, and I'm not a soccer player. I played soccer until I was like this tall, right? So seeing the game through his eyes when we stand on the field, and the women are practicing, enriches my practice, right? And it makes me a better practitioner at that point, right? And I'm not too proud or too big to say, hey, I'm going to learn something from my intern. And I think that sometimes happens where, and I've heard people say this, it's like, people at high levels say, it's like, I don't really need anybody to tell me what to do, Well, it's like, okay, you are officially closed off to learning at that point. I don't care how experienced you are. Once you say that, something happens in your brain that you're completely shut off to learning from somebody that might be below you, right? When you should treat them at eye level, right? And I think there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of progress left on the table because people are being too proud of, their standing, essentially. So I would definitely encourage you to write that blog post and provide some good examples of how experienced coaches can learn from beginners, because they view the world from a much, much simpler perspective, where people like us, right, with more experience, we focus on other things while overlooking very simple things, right? We get so hung up in the complexity of things, right? Whereas people that don't have that much experience or knowledge, they view the world much more simple. And sometimes that helps us bring us back down and actually address the problem from a different angle.
It's interesting, Manny, I've been listening to some interviews on different platforms of athletes that were pretty outstanding athletes during my time involved in track and field. And the arrogance, listening to it, has really been unbelievable. It's not been told from, here's my experiences, learn from it. So sitting telling you how wonderful they are. And that's not helpful. They need to get down into the bare bones of how did you develop as an athlete. Tell me, I want to hear, not how somebody won a gold medal. That's great, wonderful. Here's what I was thinking. Da 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 da. How did you start? What was your mentality when you started? What were you thinking when you were heading through that process of development? Who influenced you? What was your conditioning like? I don't hear any of that. I just hear, went to these games and it was really wonderful and da-da-da-da-da. Junk that isn't going to be helpful to anybody. Get into the bare bones of what made you tick and how did you develop and what was your coping mechanisms at an elite level for the challenges you were facing. That's of interest. Not how I went to Tokyo and had a great time and, won a medal and isn't that wonderful, That tells you nothing. So we need to get down into the bare bones of what went on to develop that athlete from that athlete point of view. That's of interest. That's of interest to me. I've listened to some of these interviews and I've gone, learned nothing. I want to learn about you, who you are, how you developed, what influenced you. That's the kind of thing that people need to hear.
I think that's an interesting point. It's something that you brought up earlier, and it's like we all talk about moving the industry forward, but how much can that be done if all that you're speaking about is like the greatness elements of it and like the peaks of it? But in the lobby before we started, I was telling you about the hardships I found in developing this program and how, every time I go up to this person to present my project, they were like, yeah, that's great, cool, we'll get back to you, and just nothing happened, to the point where it's like, okay, I've had enough, I'm just going to do it myself and figure out as it kind of goes. So yeah, it's a great point. Like, to move this industry forward, we need to talk about these hardships too, and some of the lower elements of what we did to achieve these great things.
You're actually interested in the longevity of this field and the longevity of sport being important. Sport competitiveness is ingrained in us as humans, right? So like we have done this since the beginning of time, right? And go ahead, Doc, because this is your kind of topic.
What you're hitting on, I think, is an important aspect. I can take you to France, and there are caves in France with drawings of two people wrestling and people watching that are at least 15,000 years old. If we trace the history of sports all the way through the Egyptians, the Greeks, and so on, in China and so on, sport has always been around, and it will be. It was an important part of people's lives for a long time. But if you think about this from a societal standpoint, for most people in the world, sport is not that important. I mean, we were in sport. This is really important to us. But for most people, they look at it as it's a game. It's entertainment. Until we get people to view sport as part of an important part of human society, you're not going to make big changes in sports science. I mean, people look at sports science almost as an afterthought. Well, the coaches will take care of that. Da-da-da-da-da-da. No, it won't completely. I mean, if you view it through history, there's always been people who have tried to determine how to coach better, how to make a better athlete. But that's not been a real important part of our culture, especially in the last 100 years. It's become more of, that's just a game. And until we get back to the view of sport as an integral part of our culture and get the people that really can make a difference to view it that way, sports science and even to some extent coaching is going to be a secondary endeavor. It won't be a primary function of a university, if that makes sense. It's still looked at as recreation, and it's not recreation. And we've got to somehow people like you, Manny, and through these podcasts and through education, have got to broaden out the education to the general population, to politicians and so on, and get them to begin to understand sport has always been important to humankind. It always has. We want to compete. we want to compete physically. It's always been there, and it probably always will, as long as there's humans alive. And it's more than a game, if that makes sense.
100%.
And somehow we've got to get people to begin to realize it's more than just a game.
I'll quote Manny, Dr. Stone's lecture. If it wasn't important, why do we have news, sport and weather? If it wasn't that important, those are your three main things on TV every night. If it's not that important.
Yeah, and I think, even from a political standpoint, from a geopolitical standpoint, like how important sport has been. We mentioned it earlier briefly, but sport and the pursuit of physical fitness and readiness has been a part of military campaigns and all that for thousands of years, right? And so when you consider that, it's like, why do the big, powers in the world compete at the Olympics? Because they want to make a statement about this is how physically capable we are, right? And it's a statement, it's a message to the rest of the world. And if you have a physical culture,
I agree with that, except the rest of the world forgets about it about 3 weeks after the Olympics. But if you go back to ancient Greece, they would when the Olympics came up, they might be at war, but they would give the athletes safe passage to the Olympics to compete.
It was the same as World War II.
Because they thought it was an important part of their culture. And we've lost that somehow. Now,
so when I've done a couple people's podcasts, and one thing that usually gets brought up is like, what's the difference between the UK and Europe and US? And something to what we alluded earlier was like the marketing and the funding of the sports and how that comes about in the US, where it's like sport is a huge deal compared to Europe, where yes, there's some sports that are huge deals, but like it's not across the board. So what I've been researching with everything that I've sort of done, a lot of my research was dedicated to like, where is funding coming from for, European sports versus US sports. European is a lot of government funded sports. So like if you're in a sports program, a developmental or a professional, a lot of your funding comes from the governing bodies. Now the governing bodies are funded by the Olympics. If you win at the Olympics, your sport has all the funding in the world, right? If in the US it's more donors, alums, like yes, there will still be some from governing bodies, but a lot of it is coming from outside sources. So like,
I hate to be political, Manny, when you're talking about the funding, but I have to be, because as people well know, the US is very much not political. Capitalism is strong in the US. A nation built on capitalism. That means your Coca-Colas and your Nikes and a very, very important part of society that give back to sport because they're very successful businesses. What worries me about the US move, there's a big move towards socialism. And socialism and capitalism don't exactly gel. If we move more towards a left-wing government, is that going to affect the funding of sport? Yes, it will. Because if capitalism moves out, what moves in to take its place? You get stuff for nothing. You don't get things for nothing in sport. That's not the approach that we need. So in my opinion, my humble opinion, getting away my political views, we got to maintain that capitalism in if sport is to be funded and successful. Because at the Olympic Committee, they'll tell you, they get 5 million plus is their gold standard for funding. 5 million plus. That's your Nikes, that's your Coca-Colas, big companies. And it's in a tiered system all the way down. So the sport from an Olympic point of view is not funded by the government in the US, and people don't realise that. It's purely funded through capitalism and companies being successful. and being able to donate. That's the important thing about the way that the US government is run.
I mean, I love the way that sport runs across there because you're not having to wait for someone to vote whether you get the funding or not. Which is like that's why like when the Olympics does come around, the US does so well. Like you aren't in the human performance space. Like if you win, that's fucking great. But you win because of the programs that you put on, because there's these outside funding opportunities. And I think that's like where my point was is like you do so well because the funding doesn't rely from governments, from governing bodies.
The funding comes from private entities too, individuals, like you said, alumni, right?
Yeah.
So and because the system is the way it is here, makes a capitalistic system, there's incentives for people donating, right? So the system feeds itself, enabling growth, right? And continued growth, right? And so once you start inhibiting that, right, growth is stalled and progress is stalled, and you can't actually advance athletes and athletics, right? And we mentioned soccer earlier. Yeah, soccer is the sport worldwide where the professionals themselves make a ton of money, but that is the sole sport in many countries around the world that people can actually advance, whereas here in the US you have so many major sports leagues, right? From the NHL, the NBA, the MLB, MLS, NFL, right? There are so many sports where people are able to provide for their families, but then you also have the not the academy side of things, but like you have the institutions that feed those pro sports, right? And those are now run the same way too. Like you consider NIL and all that kind of stuff, right? And it enables people to build $500 million athletics facilities and beyond. And that is not fathomable in many countries in Europe, just because the system is not set up that way, right? And that's why people tend to dominate. But again, rising tides raise all boats. Imagine a time where, imagine a circumstance where that kind of competitiveness would swap over to those countries, to those other countries, where now funding would be greater. And what could happen to sport and sport performance if, all of a sudden those other countries that haven't really been, that high in the international rankings, all of a sudden raise up. And now the other countries have to raise up and level up, and all of a sudden the whole development of sport, of athletes, just advances, right? Where right now it's kind of just pooled in the US, not saying that other countries or nations don't have great sport programs, but because the funding is not there, they can't really advance, right? It just stays at the low level, right? And because here we actually have a lot of opportunity for growth, we can make something happen. And I think I agree with Meg, that needs to stay that way if we want to keep sport relevant and important to humankind. And again, it has a lot of implications for the health and the prosperity of a society too, right? If people are pursuing sport and pursuing and feeding that competitive nature of humans.
I think, Manny, that was happening. Some of that was happening in Scotland when I was back there. I know Frank Dix started it off. I know there was a company called Homestead Eggs, and Homestead Eggs were big sponsors of Scottish athletics. And when I was there, it was the Bank of Scotland junior squad. They supported, but that wasn't prevalent in all sports. I mean, yes, you've got your football players with their Emirates or whatever written across their jersey, but Emirates isn't exactly a Scottish company. Scottish companies need to invest in Scottish sport, and with that you grow.
Turn. that took a political and philosophical turn.
So,
but that's how you know how all those things are just intertwined. It's not just sport. It's like there's so much more that feeds into the evolution of sport and the advancement of sport and of athletes, and how much that feeds back into the greater picture, or the bigger picture.
So I think I think this is what's kind of missing from the bigger picture of sports development and industry development for the human performance is like there's a lot of fear in touching these subjects, touching the fact that like to build a human performance environment, you need funding. And the funding doesn't always come from the money that the clients or athletes bring in. It's also like what is the government doing for like COVID's a prime example. In Scotland, there was the last businesses to come back into being opened, and like they were always talking about how like depression and everything was rising, but the one thing that's been proven to help with depression was still closed. So like I don't think we can always skip around this subject of not talking about the government and how their influence on what we do.
There's another challenge for you, Manny. How do you convince people that have their finger on the power button that they push that button in favour of sport? How do you convince?
It's always national interest. Is it a national interest, right?
And do you have the? I remember seeing a little slogan on a kid running down the track and a caption below saying, "Every little village and every little town and every little community, there's a talent just waiting to be developed." And how do you get that message across nationally to your government officials and your politicians that, hey, there is a little person someplace that can make a big difference? I mean, who would have thought Chris Hoyt from Hoyt or wherever he is in Scotland would end up being a multi gold medalist in the Olympic Games? And who would have thought? Somebody saw something in him and developed him.
I think it comes down to return of investment, right?
Yeah. I was having a conversation with one of the chairmen for Sports Scotland the other day. He would have actually been at the Sports Institute when you were there, but he was judo based, Meg. Sorry? Richard Kenny. He was a judoka. I'll pull him up. But he was talking about like how hard it is to. So okay, it's no secret that like Scotland has a great talent pool for athletes and sports talent, but because of the system that it runs with England, it's kind of hard for us to push through because we're still attached to England. So what we were saying is like, how do we get these 5 to 6 year olds to 7 year olds, 8, 9, 10 to push through in a way that even when they go up to national teams and the Olympic committees and all that stuff to still shine through? And it does come from that human development side of it where you have to advocate for every athlete as their journey progresses.
Do you think, and this is a question really, do you think that a model similar to how it is here could work in Scotland, where you have private investors essentially from different parts of Scotland, right? I mean, rich people are everywhere, if you will, right? But convincing rich people that, hey, if you invest in this, we can develop the next generation of athletes. Small town or community, there's somebody that actually made it in terms of, financial success. Can you tap into those people and find a way to sell it to them that, if athletic success happens, here in the US, they put names of the person that, was the main investor on the building, right? So the different stadium names, or the locker room is named after the main investor, and so on and so forth. So if there are people, and I don't know if this is government regulated in Scotland or in other countries, that, hey, if I donate, say, 10 million or 10 million pounds, let's say, to this local community here so they can build an athletic development center or sports development center, then I'm going to put my name on that. And then I get recognition. And because I get a recognition, people know about my company and my product and my service. And that feeds in and of itself, right? Because that's the whole point in the US, right? I'm an investor, right? I donate, I'm a booster, right? And my name is being put on the wall. And then people Google that name. It's like, oh, they have this company. I'm going to buy this company's service. And because there's thousands and thousands and thousands of followers for a single university or even a high school, all these people are now pouring into the company of that particular investor. It's just sponsorship at the end of the day, right? But the the sponsor themselves, the person that donated, they get a tax incentive from donating, right? And I think that's still the same thing in Scotland, and I know in Germany it is, right? But then getting the public attention for having made that donation, for having made that contribution to advance sport and young athlete development in a certain local community now puts that person into the spotlight. And then that might be a catalyst, having used that word again, to other people all over the country, in Scotland, for instance, or in other countries, to do the same thing, right? Because now they see there's something that I can put my name out there for, or my family's name, or my company's name, or I'm gonna put what they're doing here with NIL now. I'm gonna put a patch of my company on the jersey, right? And that's it. Here's my money. I get a little bit of recognition, put a patch on there, and go develop athletes. All right, and then you can tell success stories like that multi-medalist that you were just mentioning, and just kind of build it from there, right? But that is the model that works here in the U.S., right? And that is the capitalistic way of things, right? And the system that feeds itself.
Manny, do you know the Orium?
Yeah.
Who built that?
I think they've got actually a lot of investment from, I want to say Hibs, the football team or soccer team. But they'll obviously have all their sponsors.
It seems to me something like that could be sold, in a sense, sold to companies.
Stakeholders.
And invest in that, because that's an ideal, that's a pretty nice center down there.
Look at us doing a little business consulting here.
Yeah, no kidding.
Here you go, Scotland.
Manny, when you think of Scotland, what product do you think of?
Or
Whiskey.
haggis.
Scotch.
Yeah.
I mean, how many? Look at Whiskey Trail, Glenmorangie, Glenfiddich, Chivas Regal, all these companies, all the way up the. Who owns them? And then you get your puritanical people in Scotland. Oh, we don't want whiskey involved with sport. BS. Get it involved with sport.
Yeah.
Get it involved. Who is it that's running the oil issue in Scotland? Is it coming from the south, or is it based in Scotland? Have we got an oil company in Aberdeen that's doing well? When you think about it, there's a lot of well-to-do companies that are in Scotland that need to be tapped into.
And you just need to find a way to sell it right. Give proper examples. I think there's a market out there, but it's just exposing or exploiting those things is key. And again, it's not. I'm not saying that model that works here will work 1-to-1 over there, right? That's not what I'm saying, because the mentality of people is different, right? And then that is what we talked about at the beginning is cultural differences in sport, right? Because countries are so much older with so much more history, which means the mentality is also ingrained, right? I'm from Germany, and a lot of ways of thinking are just ingrained in us, whereas a young country like the US, as a true amazing social experiment in and of itself, is much more open to new things and to advancements and to opportunity creation than old countries are, right, with a lot of history. So that's why this is the land of opportunity, because everything's young, and we can really push for the new and the better, quote unquote, right? Not saying it's always better, right? But that's why that's possible here. Whereas kind of set in our ways mindsets that exist in a lot of places in Europe is sometimes the hindrance to progress, right? So finding a way, you being over there, you knowing the mentality of the people, well, how can we take something from the system in the US that works in terms of generating capital to pour into the future of sports in Scotland, right? While acknowledging the history of the country and the mentality of the people, right? And then kind of merging those two. I think you're at a great intersection there, having experience and a background with the American side of things and a lot of connections with people on this side of the pond, right? And your heritage, essentially, right? And if you can combine those two, if you can create some overlap, I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth, for development in sport, yeah.
I know I asked this sort of last time that we kind of spoke, but I want to get a little bit more behind of what you think this industry needs to sort of develop from here. And I want to get each one of you's takes, because I know they'll be slightly different, on where the current industry is and where you hope it starts moving into.
Doc hit on it a little earlier, is raising sport to the level where people realise how important it is to society. And it's not a recreational activity, not something that you do on the side. Unfortunately, as long as sport is seen as a very young person's activity, that may continue. But I think the more we see things like age group things happening and masters competitions, and realising that sport is important for all age groups. And there's competition available for all groups. I mean, I just picked up the newspaper the other day there and saw a 94-year-old guy just broke the world record for the 100 metres for his age group from 90 to 95. Sport is such an important part of society that we've got to raise the level of understanding what sport is and what it does. I think that's the challenge, is raising awareness and raising the importance to society in general.
I think 100% agree with Meg, but where do you start with that? We've kind of regressed, and I have a couple of women on my soccer team that are in education, right, in primary education. So they're in, with elementary schools and middle schools and stuff like that, right? And they tell me that there has been this regression of physical activity in schools, right? And where is the first place that you learn? Obviously, it's home, right? So the first few years as a child, it's like, yeah, you go to kindergarten maybe and all that kind of stuff, but the parents teach you, right? So if your parents are not physically cultured, then what are you left with after, let's say, age 5 or so, right? School, right? If they remove recess, which recess is like you get to move, but we're mostly in the classroom. Now you remove the get to move 30 minutes and you remove PE class entirely from the curriculum and from the day. Now kids do not even get a chance to experience the benefit of just pure physical activity. I'm not talking about sport yet, but just physical activity, right? And then we get into the downslopes of lack of physical activity and what it can do to the body and the brain, etc., right? Well, I think that's where it starts. It has to start in education, right? That we tap into what humans are made to do. We're made to move, right? And we need to invest in people moving because it eventually helps them develop their brains. And developed brains can advance a society. So we need to move to be healthy up here too, right? And from that point on, just like in everything else, you progressively overload, right? Just like we do in training, we progressively overload the stimulus that kids are accustomed to or are exposed to in the educational setting instead of removing it, right? And so with that, we're building that competitiveness. And I like, people on social media, they bring in that La Sierra High School thing where they had this tier system of high school students that were extremely physically cultured, extremely physical capable, and that was like the John F. Kennedy area, right? And bringing that kind of a mentality through the school system, through the educational system, creating a physically cultured society again, right? Where you built that up, and I think it's not something that happens right away. It's a generational thing, right? We are where we are. We have the awareness that something is not right or what it should be, or it's even regressing. Let's figure out what it could be and then create action steps to create what we need, right? But I think it starts in young life, right? In education, because most kids in civilized parts of the world go to school, right? And so that is the best place to expose them to sport and to expose them to physicality, right? And then teach them the benefits of that, because then as they go through the age groups, they learn. They learn about their bodies, they learn about the importance of sport and the effect sport has on them as overall human beings, right? And even if they don't go into competitive sports later on, they know the benefits of it and they can pass it along, and that again feeds itself. That's my take, Doc.
I mean, I'm by far the oldest person on this podcast. So, if you go back to when I was in elementary school in the 50s and 60s, we actually played games, in elementary school and what we call junior high school and high school. And you were taught a sport. I mean, we played sports, and we actually, even in elementary school, we competed against other elementary schools. Now you're lucky if you get physical education twice a week, much less play a sport. So as Alex said, we've lost a lot of things there, not only an appreciation for sport, but also an appreciation for just getting out and moving around. And that's too bad, but I guarantee you those same kids can play a game on their phone. And that is too bad. Our appreciation of physical activity, but I think especially our appreciation of what sport is. I think sport has been, for most people, not everybody, but for most people, it's been brought down to the level of recreation. And you should do this simply to stay active and maybe be healthier, which is not bad. Don't get me wrong. But we've, in a sense, belittled the importance and the noble cause of sport.
I just wonder sometimes, Manny, about just being able to get out into a playground and sit and create movement. I remember in primary school, we'd just go out and play rounders. We didn't have a teacher. We didn't have anybody telling us how to run or how to steal bases or whatever. We just went out and through play and recreational play, learned how to be part of physical movement. Going out there and playing what we used to call paldies or hopscotch or stuff like that involves physical movement. I haven't really, I hate to be one of these people banging technology, but we're on our phones too much. We need to get off the phones, and they're making a move here in the US to make sure that until you're 14, then the parents have got to okay the phone. That's starting to be legislated on at the moment. And I think that's a good idea. Get kids off the phone and let them explore and create physical movement themselves. Get out and climb trees. Get out and play.
It's going to be past menus.
No, it's 6 o'clock here, 6 p.m. here.
It's dinner time, bro.
If we talked your ear off, Manny.
No. I think these conversations are really important, because physical activity is being depreciated, and unless it's decreasing, whether it's through phones, video games, just schools not having the initiative to, have break time, have, physical sports. And again, I think it's a real shame, because when I was growing up, certainly, we were outside all the time. I climbed trees, I jumped off trees, I played in jungle gyms. There was a whole host of things for me to do that didn't involve me being inside. And I think that's kind of being lost in this iPad situation where all kids have iPads. And it's great for learning, but there's also a time and a place for how much to give them time on that screen.
Get back to this old argument, is it body or mind?
Yeah.
We've got away, at one point, we got away from the body and focused on the mind. I think there has to be a balance.
But the mind deteriorated as we started focusing on the mind, and in that process, the body deteriorated too, so we didn't really benefit from that. And, not just the kids, but it's, occupations, jobs these days are much less physical. I just read a paper summary the other day that said, Achilles ruptures in certain populations have, or not in certain populations, overall have increased, multifold. I don't have the correct number in my head right now, but a lot of it has to do with, people are still being recreationally active, but they are not generally active, right? And that has to do with jobs being much less active. So now that we are less active, we think we have to catch on with recreational activity to, to feel good about ourselves, our bodies, right? And at that point, we start getting hurt because we're not generally active. We don't have that general tolerance for physical movement. And that started early on in life, right? We stopped moving at a young age, and then we pick physical activity up as we're becoming, young adults, and we get into it too quickly, too aggressively, and we get hurt, and then we realize, I guess sport's not for me, I'm just going to stay inactive. And that's the negative loop that feeds itself as well, right? So
I'll stick my 2 cents in again, Manny, and then I'll shut up completely after this.
Never do that, Meg.
There's a really, really good broad TED Talk by a guy from England, actually, called Sir Ken Robertson. And he talks about, in fact, it was one of the leading TED Talks back in 2005, 2006. And he talks about creativity in children, big thing. And he uses a demonstration of a girl called Vivian Lynn. I think it was Vivian Lynn. Her mother thought, and the school teachers thought, that she had, what do you call it, ADD or ATD or whatever the initials are, because she couldn't sit still. She was always being a pain at class, and she was interfering with this and that. So her mother took her to a psychologist, and the psychologist sat in a room with her and left her in that room and came out and put some music on. Yeah, that's him. When he put the music on, she started to move. In fact, the psychologist said, "There's nothing wrong with your daughter. Don't give her any medication. Take her to dancing school. Let her dance. She has to move to think." And then she was the main director behind Cats, the musical. She has done umpteen amount of different types of musicals and been involved. And the psychologist says, she's a dancer. There's nothing wrong with her. She's a dancer. She has to move to think. How many kids are we missing out on?
Yeah.
Because they're not moving.
And we're just medicating them. Oh.
Yeah. Anyway, that's my thoughts. I'm going to be quiet.
I never want you to be quiet. One of the best things that I was able to get out from our conversations in Germany was the storytelling between you, Mike, and Alex. Like, everything has a story and a way for your rationale of thinking. I always, coaches sometimes worry, and I think Alex was actually one of them too. It's like, oh, I'm rambling on, or I'm talking too much about this one thing, I'm going off on a tangent. But I think you actually are able to better express yourself when you're able to freely just articulate your thoughts as they come. So, I never see rambling on as a bad thing. It's more pieces to that puzzle that you've got in your head that we can then benefit from. And that's how I look at this podcast. It's a collection of stories, not interviews.
I really appreciate that, because I know I've caught myself on a few occasions, and sometimes I wish I was like Doc, just quiet, observing, and listening more. But it's just kind of it just bursts out, and I'm always happy to get that opportunity, because I realize at that moment what I'm passionate about and where I want to focus my energy, and where it's best placed. So I appreciate the opportunity, and I 100% agree with you that, a lot of times people are being, muted, or not given the opportunity to share that, because if I look at the time right now, that's, almost 3 hours or something. And, on a typical podcast, it's like, oh, we're hit the hour mark, and we're going to stop here. With you, that's not the case. And just like Meg was just explaining with the girl that just needed to dance, sometimes people just need to be given an opportunity to express themselves and their thoughts, so they can get it out there, for one, but then also build on whatever they just expressed, and then continue their work from there, right? Because maybe it was just the opportunity to open yourself up to continue your work and remove a blockage, essentially. So thank you for that.
That's how I see this. It'd be very easy for me to do half hours and move on, ask my 3 questions and move on. But I don't think you get the full picture of how that person's brain works in relation to what they're actually doing. Because if I sent 3 questions to you guys before we started this, we would answer the 3 questions and then that's it. Whereas as we've touched on so many things that I wasn't originally going to be talking about, but we touched on them, and we developed this ecosystem for what is this podcast now. And it's that thing of pushing the human performance industry to a better place. And that comes from conversations with founders of the industry and the research of the industry and weightlifting. And then we've got Alex, who's 10 years in. I'm, what would that be, 13 years in? Like, there's so much that is missed if we don't all talk about everything together.
Feeding off each other, you know, like I listen to Meg and all of a sudden, it sparks a thought in my head that I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to piggyback off of that. And sometimes like, you know, Doc starts talking, I'm like, okay, I'm going to take a step back because he needs to get his perspective out there too. And so, which I think just comes way too short because there's so much goodness that Doc has to offer, and I feel a little bad that, you know, I was talking so much because I would encourage people that get the opportunity to listen to lectures from Dr. Stone to take advantage of that and really listen closely and really take notes, and because there's a lot of crumbs that explain or provide a lot of direction for the future.
I think, Manny, one thing that I've always liked and enjoyed about Mike's lectures are he'll give skeleton, but you've got to go away and put the meat in the bones. You know, and he does that through the enormous amount of references that are there. So what he does is he feeds you or stimulates the intellect, if you will. And if you really want to explore this, go and look at these references.
And you can remain a skinny skeleton, or you can really put some meat on the bones, like Meg says, you know. And it's so what I tell my athletes too. It's you get out what you put in, you know. So,
I mean, you can take it back to that analogy that you made, and they'll open the doors, but you have to walk through it. I really appreciate you guys for coming on and sort of spending this afternoon with me, or morning for you guys, really. I know yous are coming to Scotland soon.
Yeah, well, it'll be sometime this summer. We're not sure exactly when, but when we do make up our mind on the dates, we'll definitely contact you, Manny.
100%, because I know you've got some agendas here, but I would love to get back with you guys and talk more as well.
You got a weight room there so they can lift.
Yeah.
I've got plenty.
We need to keep our weight up.
Thank you, Manny. Appreciate it.